Great. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Harriet Fraad. It is we love you here. I hogged you once again. I apologize.
I'm happy to be hogged.
Dr. Harriet Fraad is the host of Capital Hits Home, and it's not just
co-host of its
co-hosts
with Max Golding. Yes.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you.
Everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, Dr. Liam O'Mara is back, and Professor Adnan Husain is back. And I just want to give Professor Adnan Husain a compliment for Friday's office hours, because you and Rariki were talking about Israel, Jews, whether or not Muslims and Jews can get along, which they have. They always got along up until 47, 48. It was one of the greatest conversations I've ever heard at office hours.
That's very kind of you to say. It was totally unplanned. Rariki happened to have that slot. He noticed I was there. He said, "Oh, do you want to stick around?" I wasn't sure I'd be able to because I was tired, but luckily he was talking about things that I teach and research and am interested in. And so it just flowed out, and we had a wonderful conversation that was really enjoyable, and I hope people learned something from it. And there's a lot of wonderful surprises in history. I really think that history is more exciting and interesting than fiction, because even in fantasy and science fiction literature, I think history has more strangeness and more surprises for us to discover, and interesting stories that are better than ones you would even try and make up.
We have Professor Liam O'Mara here. He's a professor of history.
Exactly.
And ideas. And I'm going to let you guys talk about whatever you want. Although on Friday's show, I'm going to have Dr. Ergani on. He's an Israeli professor, and he's always been critical of the occupation. And I pre-taped the interview, and he said, Jews in America have no idea what's going on in Israel in terms of criticizing Netanyahu, and that the conversation among Israeli Jews is completely different than the conversation among American Jews, that American Jews filter everything, this is what he said, filter everything through the prism of the Holocaust, and they are not willing to criticize Israel the way practically every Israeli is, including the ones who support Netanyahu. Although he did say this is what I wanted to ask you. I asked him the following questions. Did Iron Dome work? He said yes, which I found surprising. I don't think you can shoot missiles out of the sky. I asked him if COVID is gone in Israel. He said yes, COVID is gone, but they did not vaccinate the Palestinians. And I asked him if he supported a one-state or a two-state solution. He said that he supports a two-state solution and that the two-state solution is not dead. He said he did not see, he said that the militant wing of the Netanyahu coalition will fight a one-state solution, that it's just, he didn't think it was doable. I asked him about apartheid versus Israel as the colonizer, and he said it's more the colonizer. And I asked him about 20% of the Israeli population being Arab, whether or not they could be a fifth column, if they're going to come back to, anyway, he said no, that essentially the Arabs, the Israeli Arabs, are second-class citizens, but they don't want the same exact things that the Palestinians in Gaza want. And he said the Palestinians in the West Bank don't necessarily want what the Palestinians in Gaza want, that they're obviously not a monolithic. There's nothing monolithic going on, obviously, in the Middle East. Anyway, if you want to respond to any of that or talk about what you want to talk about, go ahead.
You hit so many things that I would want to talk about.
Okay.
It's going to be hard to keep track of all of them.
Let's start with something easy. Iron Dome, the dream that started with Ronald Reagan, that if we spend enough money, we can shoot missiles out of the sky. We're being told that Israel shot 90% of the missiles out of the sky during this last war. Do you believe that? I don't believe it.
Well, yeah, honestly, the Iron Dome system does work fairly well. The big issue there is that these are pretty slow-moving rockets, so they're a lot easier to target. Hitting ICBMs at the speed they're going and at the altitude they're going, you're covering. It's a lot harder to do. The system's been working relatively well for quite some time. It's ungodly expensive, and given that nearly every rocket fired out of Gaza, they don't go anywhere. I mean, people are very seldom injured by them, but it seems worth it to them somehow to spend insane amounts of money on shooting rockets out of the sky rather than I don't know, dealing with the fact that they have a giant open air prison and people are angry.
Right, they're $50,000 a pop, by the way. I looked
Yeah, and all the money spent to develop the system in the first place. I mean, it is just an insanely expensive proposition. But of course, states seem to love excuses to spend huge amounts of money on the military. Yeah, why not, stoke some fear and feed the military industrial complex if you can, rather than, I don't know, solving real problems. But
so is Israel an apartheid state? Or
by definition, it honestly always has been. Yeah, by definition, it is, and a colonizer. I mean, they used to be pretty honest about that. I mean, you go back to pre-Israel, look at a lot of the Zionist organizations. We had like the Jewish Colonization Society. I mean, they were pretty explicitly aware of the fact that they were settlers, and they actually consciously cultivated a settler ethos, similar to the whole like settling the American West and all that. We don't like it now because our attitudes have changed. One of the things that's distinctive about Israel and makes this conflict so difficult for people to grasp, I think, and this is especially true for Americans because, yeah, our media does not cover this well. The Israeli media regularly calls Israel an apartheid state. You'll never see that in an American newspaper. But we're honestly dealing with a state that made perfect sense in the context of 19th century nationalisms, which were pretty explicitly racist and, imperialistic in the first place. And it was entirely in step with everything else. What the Zionists were doing was no different than any other nationalist movement. The fact that it is still an ethno-national movement in the 21st century is what makes it difficult to deal with. And people have a hard time separating, and I run into this all the time. I did it just today. I ran into it. People always assume that if you're criticizing Israel, you're somehow saying that the state shouldn't exist, that it should be like destroyed or something. And like, no, that has literally nothing to do with it. The people live there already. The question is, what the fuck do we do about it now that actually guarantees equality for all people? And that's where, I mean, and this is a bigger topic, but I would really differ with that question about the two-state solution. That's a really thorny one. That two-state solution has never been possible, and it's never going to be possible. It's simply cover for the far right to continue, expanding settlements and create their own kind of apartheid one-state solution. You're never going to be able to divide that land effectively, not in terms of its resources, not in terms of the way the human geography where people are spread out in the first place, not in terms of people's romantic attachments to territory. I mean, hell, most of the Jewish religious sites are in the West Bank. That's the biblical heartland, the place where most of Israel is built up, all on the coast. Those were Canaanite city-states. That had nothing to do with biblical Israel. But the Palestinians happen to be living right around all those areas. So do you really think that people are ever going to give that territory up?
Let's stay there for 1 second and let me turn to Professor Husain. Do you mind if I stay with this, Professor Husain? Is it Judea and Samaria? Is that the region of the West Bank? That would be Greater Israel, Professor
Well, that'd be
Husain?
using the terms that settlers use for it, in Judea and Samaria, thinking in terms of like, ancient states, but it's really where Judah and Yisrael, the northern and southern kingdoms were originally set.
Okay, so Professor Husain, it is true that a huge segment of the Israeli population from day one, from 47 and 48, wanted all of Israel. This is something that you're not taught in Hebrew school, that we're taught the Israelis wanted to divide the land. But the truth is there is a Benjamin Netanyahu's father believed in what was called Greater Israel, share none of it. So that strain is baked in to the foundation of Israel, all of Israel. And yet Netanyahu won't say that, right? They're not being honest about what they really want.
Well, some people are willing and willing to say what they want, and I think there's increasing far right boldness to articulate, or they've always been ready and willing to say it. It's just that they were considered, too far, too extreme, not part of the political consensus, and so on. But increasingly, they are making an impact in mainstream.
Kind of like the Republicans.
Discourse.
Kind
Absolutely.
of like the John Birchers
kind of
have become normalized.
That's right. Exactly the same kind of dynamic has been at work. And as a result, you will now hear people articulating that idea of the Greater Israel. And you have to remember that Israel is, if not the only, certainly one of the very few countries that has never declared its borders. It doesn't recognize it, a set of borders, right? So in fact, actually, when you go through certain checkpoints in the West Bank, for example, into the Jordan Valley, you're, at the checkpoint, you're welcomed into Israel, right? And it's like, well, wait a minute, this isn't really part of any declared territory recognized by anybody as actually Israel, but that's the language that's used to describe that you have moved into the territory of Israel. And that is partly because the maximalist conception is to extend, to these presumed biblical borders all the way, beyond the Jordan River, in fact, actually. So this is definitely has been an aspiration. Now, there you have others who were realists and thought, well, it wouldn't be possible to take all that territory, or were willing to, recognize effectual limits as the outcomes of wars. And also, there were calculations about how do you maximize the territory and minimize the population, the subject population. And that was something I was very interested to learn when I read Ilan Pappé's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, that David Ben-Gurion had really mapped out pretty carefully, that there were certain areas of dense Palestinian population that maybe would be okay to avoid trying to absorb, whereas more isolated, thinner, density of population, those could be, those people could be made refugees, or with a few, a little bit of a push, you might be able to take that territory, and so on. And one of the areas that he was willing to absorb into the state of Israel was the northern part of Galilee. And it was very interesting why. I think the reason why was because that was predominantly Christian population. And in point of fact, what David Ben-Gurion was doing was exactly what the Crusaders, when they came and established the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, did, which is that they were able to settle and absorb parts of the historic Christian Arab population and try and remove as many. They certainly wouldn't settle close to and within majority Muslim territory. There might be some mixed areas, that was fine, but actually they mostly established their major settlements and villages and agricultural kind of estates, and built a ring of fortifications and Templar castles and hospitaller castles, basically in order, in many places where you currently have major outposts and installations in high areas and territories that can survey the valley below and so on. And so in some ways, there's a very clear colonial project that unfolded that in some ways had its precedence in the Latin Crusader kingdoms. So they're not the first to have figured out how you could create an ethno-national or religiously exclusive sort of state in a colonial circumstance.
So I want to ask Dr. Liam O'Mara to respond to that, but for my listeners, David Ben-Gurion is considered the George Washington of Israel. He, I think, was Mapai, or his party was the Mapai, which later became the Labor Party. And up until recently, I always thought David Ben-Gurion was against the occupation of the West Bank. He warned after the '67 war that this will come back and bite the Israelis, which it has. But new studies show that he may have participated in ethnic cleansing. What do we know about?
Very, very clearly, and this is one of the things that actually bothers me about our understanding. You always have people saying, well, the Israelis wanted peace and they wanted the UN division of it, and they were totally willing to accept whatever they could get, and it's just the Palestinians always refused. And it's bullshit from the start. If you look back at all the initial division proposals when they were made, every time Zionists accepted them, every time, we have Ben-Gurion's own letters and journal entries on this, when they said, hey, we'll give you this tiny little state along the coast. If you go back to original discussions with the British in the 30s, they're like, yeah, we'll take that, and then we'll conquer all the rest of it later. Because if you take any state at all and you have unlimited immigration and sovereignty and the ability to build a military, then obviously they can expand. Ben-Gurion was a territorial maximalist himself, and only came to regret it after the '67 war and the reality of that many Palestinians densely populated in areas, especially since the West Bank's population had skyrocketed with the 48 refugees. And that, again, is a problem that people just do not recognize in the U.S. and often don't recognize in Israel. Israelis don't really talk about this stuff.
Excuse me for 1 second. Ben-Gurion had a change of heart then. That by the time he died, he realized... Largely because the world had been changing, and by the time the Zionist movement was talking about ethnic cleansing in the 40s, it was already getting to be kind of a dirty word. After World War II was the last major time that we saw massive ethnic cleansing and movement of populations. Tons of that in Europe. It was to governments, and within media discourses, think about the solution like the Greco-Turkish War. Massive transfers of population. They just kicked out, you're Christian, get the hell out. Oh, you're Muslim, get the hell out. And everyone thought, that's a perfect way to solve the problem. Bullshit. Exactly. It was. Yeah. But people were still thinking you can get away with massive ethnic cleansing. And but in 1948,
well, they called them population transfers, and that's the language that has been used sometimes as coded language in contemporary Israel. But that was actually the language in the 1920s that was used to reconcile Greek nationalism and Turkish nationalism after you had these imperial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious states like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire. The breakdown of those as a result of forces of nationalism ended up creating all kinds of problems like this, where you had mixed populations that were now a problem for an ethno-national exclusive state, which was the understanding of what would be a legitimate polity is a nation state that's based on an idea of nation built upon ethnic and, ethno-linguistic, characteristics. So Greece and Turkey brokered some arrangement where hundreds of thousands of people were uprooted from their homes and told, you can't live here anymore because there's a state for you that's, across this border and you have to go. And I've met so many Greek-speaking Christian Turks who spoke Turkish. It was their first language was Turkish, who their families ended up having to go to Greece, and they did not want to. They were from Istanbul. They were cosmopolitans. They were part of this, different world, and now they had to narrowly be, kind of refugees in Greece. And you had the same thing happening with Turks. So that language was there, and as Liam is saying, this was sort of the period, the last time it was allowable to really talk like that.
Right.
Right about the time that the Zionist movement is, having realistic aspirations of establishing an ethnic, religious, exclusive state in this territory through the 30s, basically.
Right. And by the time you get into the 1960s, we're sort of like drifting away from the use of that language, but transfer, like that is the literal word in the Zionist text discussing it. And we actually have a paper trail discussing this with Ben Gurion's approval and everything else, that the only time they would be able to get away with massive population transfers, massive expulsions, is under the fog of war. So during the 1948 conflict, and people forget, they think today that the entire coast strip was all Jewish, just because there was a lot of Jewish settlements there. But it was like Arab village, Jewish village, Arab, like totally intermixed. But during the conflict, soldiers, Haganah soldiers or Irgun soldiers, would surround a village on three sides, shoot in the air, point at people and say, okay, time to move. And people naturally fled. And that all, it's still there. We tend to paper over the fact that 400 villages were depopulated during the 1948 war as a deliberate policy, because the only time you could get away with that is during that kind of conflict. Afterwards, there would be an official state, there would be a legal government that would have responsibility, and legally, like ethically, we were drifting away from this idea that countries can expel populations. If that was acceptable, Israel would have done it a long time ago. Israel would have expelled the entire population across, but it isn't. And they can't get away with that. That's the big problem. And that's what Ben Gurion came to recognize by the end of the 1960s, that taking that territory was really going to bite them in the ass. He had actually come to be happy that they didn't take the Hill Country during the 1948 war because of that large population. Up to that point, in the 1930s and 40s, he was totally in favor of taking the entire territory. But by the time of the division of territory in 1948, he was like, yeah, okay, this is actually a good idea. We probably would have had a lot more problems if we had taken in that many Arabs, because they wanted a democracy that was ethno-national. And you literally can't do that. It's always going to be a contradiction. Today, even if you exclude Gaza and the West Bank, Israel's about 22% Arab. It's always a mixed population, but they want it to be a Jewish-dominated democracy.
Let me get some history here. And again, for my listeners, I want to position myself. So I think it's important for people to know where I think I stand, where I used to stand. I still believe that there needs to be a Jewish state in the Middle East as a sanctuary, a haven for Jews, because I believe that anti-Semitism will exist no matter what Jews do. I just don't think there's anything you can do to stop anti-Semitism. I used to think that a two-state solution was the answer. I used to think that it was the Palestinians who were talking out of both sides of their mouths, that Yasser Arafat, when he was negotiating at Camp David in 2000 with Ehud Barak, the prime minister, and Clinton, I used to think that we were so close in 2000 to getting a two-state solution. And then at the very last minute, Yasser Arafat, head of the PLO, said, I can't do this. And he tricked Clinton. He tricked Ehud Barak. I have now come to learn that neither side wanted a two-state solution, and that there's a large segment of the Israeli government that wants it all and always wanted it all, and was never willing to admit what exactly they wanted. I don't think you can accomplish anything until you're honest about what you want. So nobody has been negotiating in good faith.
Right. And I can complicate that 2000 situation for you too.
Well, hang on for 1 second, just because my listeners don't follow this. I'm really grateful for this conversation. So I'm learning that what I was told is not true. And until people tell me exactly what they want. So the question that the media should be asking Bibi Netanyahu when he comes to America is, do you believe that Israel should own the West Bank? Because that will have consequences politically for him. Let him say it out loud, because his core supporters believe that Israel is entitled to greater Israel. You have to get these people on the record when you interview them and ask them, what do you believe? What do you want? And of course, our media would never do that. When Bibi Netanyahu, the first question Bibi Netanyahu should be asked is, what do you want? What do you want? They don't ask him that.
Honestly, it's kind of pointless, because he already is on record saying that they should annex the West Bank, and it's been the official.
He's also said he supports a two-state solution.
Because he's told he has to, but his idea of a two-state solution is a fully demilitarized series of cantonments, basically like South African Bantustans. It's not a two-state solution in any way, and never was. The 2000 situation you mentioned with Ehud Barak is, I mean, it's actually a lot simpler than that to get to. We don't even have to get to like Yasser Arafat saying, well, I can't deal with this until we deal with like the Haram al-Sharif or anything else, because Arafat Barak came back to Clinton and told him, and is on record telling him this, that his own government had come and said they can't pass it, that it doesn't matter what they agree there, it won't pass. And that's the reality. If you look at, if Netanyahu was actually honest and said, I want a two-state solution, it would not matter, because his own party has taken unanimous votes calling for annexation of the West Bank. He could not pass it. His own party would vote against it.
And have they been asked, okay, you annex the West Bank, what do you want to do about the Palestinians? What do you do with them? Has anybody asked them that question?
Yeah, it shows up all the time, because politicians have to make promises. Netanyahu is constantly trying to cultivate support among the settlers and whatnot. He does talk about this. Our media doesn't have to ask. We should just report what he's actually saying and has said already, and don't.
What does he say?
The idea is, at best, to offer people what they gave the people in East Jerusalem. Israel unilaterally and illegally annexed a wide swath of territory around Jerusalem, not Jerusalem itself. And I hate that in the media, it's always like Jerusalem should not be divided. What is called Jerusalem in Israel is a whole series of separate towns and villages all around it, including a weird little finger that they pushed up into the West Bank just to get an airport. They just drew a line around some areas and called that Jerusalem. But when they took that territory and annexed it legally according to Israeli law, now granted, whether anybody recognizes that is beside the point, but under Israeli law, that is part of Israel. And they did not give citizenship.
Weren't they?
They gave a residence card.
They offered citizenship to this is what I read the other night, that they offered citizenship to the Palestinians in Jerusalem and they rejected it.
No, they offered permanent residence there. They offered citizenship to the Druze and the Golan when they extended Israeli law there in the early 1980s. They said, you guys can be citizens if you want. And the Druze said, we would prefer this weird status with nothing there, because if y'all ever trade us back to Syria, the Syrians would be pissed if we took it. So they're in like they're screwed. They're one way or the other. But there's no intention of offering rights to it, because that's a whole bunch of extra people who would vote. And that gets back to the core question and what the Zionists were debating in the 1940s. If in order to have a democratic state, you had to ensure a Jewish majority. That again, it's old style ethno-nationalist thinking. My idea would have been a long time ago Israel has no constitution. Why not write a bloody constitution that says this is a Jewish state and we have this flag and Hebrew is one of our languages, and lock all that stuff in, make it very difficult to change, make sure that, Friday and Saturday are the days off, not Saturday and Sunday, like lock in certain things. Okay, Yom Kippur, businesses close, and then just extend equal rights to everybody. But they won't do that. It could still be a Jewish state and still offer equality to all people. I mean, there are official churches in tons of European countries. Sweden is an officially Christian state. Most Swedes are not Christians, but it has an official established church. Israel could do the same kind of thing, but it doesn't want to. It's still clinging to an old style ethno-nationalist component. And for that, you cannot have voting Arabs. You need to keep that population down.
Although 20% of Israel is Arab and they do vote.
Right. And if
they're second-class citizens.
Right, exactly. And that's where, it's legal to discriminate in Israel. We talk about Jim Crow laws in the U.S. You can legally say Arabs cannot live in my town. Arabs can't live in my neighborhood. I can proudly say my business employs no Arabs. In the words of
Jimmy Carter, it's perfectly acceptable for a neighborhood to maintain its ethnic purity.
Yes.
When Jimmy Carter was running for president, he said, I have no problem with communities wanting to maintain their ethnic purity. And
well, this is an interesting issue because, some people object to the characterization of the society as an apartheid society. And they say, well, it's not like South Africa or Jim Crow South, where you have different facilities, different drinking fountains, and so on. But somebody who I think captured it well is Yuri Davis, and he said, yes, it isn't that they have petty apartheid, that is at the level of, you have to sit in the back of the bus or that kind of a thing, but what you have is structural apartheid. There's a deeper kind of set of laws and exclusions that maintains control of the land, or because the military it doesn't allow most Arabs to participate in the military. They're excluded from that. And so many other civic rights and civic privileges are tied to, service in the military. Even, of course, you could say, that, in such a society, military service is, even if it's not a requirement for various accommodations and privileges, it creates a network of affiliation that is absolutely central to social organization. But there is legal exclusions as well. So when you have that, that's a structural apartheid difference. So when your friend or the colleague was saying, well, he thought of it more as a colonial situation rather than, an apartheid situation, part of it may be because it's not exactly like Jim Crow South or South Africa in terms of these kind of superficial social exclusions. But when they say that it's a colonial situation, I think people are missing that it's a settler colonial situation, and that is per force structurally apartheid, because it's one community that has taken over land and is exerting a dominant force over the rest of society, whether it's a majority or a minority. That's a structurally apartheid type.
But Gaza, there are no settlers anymore in Gaza.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, I'm talking more about like West Bank and also 1948 Israel, that there are, structurally that it is an apartheid situation, even if it doesn't have the very obvious social exclusions that are what Yuri Davis called petty apartheid, right?
Okay, and so just look at the division of resources. I mean, they will splash out huge amounts of money in brand new settlements for Israeli Jews, but Israeli Arab towns struggle to get any services at all, and just trash piles up. They can't get any help at all. They choose not to invest in those communities. It's not legally equal. And you do have a different type of petty apartheid. You don't need to enforce a lot of that stuff legally because people self-segregate. And I've seen this even among self-professed like liberal or Jews in Israel. Oh yeah, no, I have no problem with Palestinians. Blah 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 blah. I had this. I have to tell this little story to students to kind of like illustrate a point. In one of the summers that I lived there, I got to know a number of the faculty at the University of Haifa. And Haifa is one of the mixed cities because they didn't expel a lot of the Arab population during the creation of the state. So it's still somewhere around a quarter Arab. But the Arab population is concentrated in a couple of neighborhoods. They're like down in Wadi Nisnas, they don't come out. Israeli Jews just don't interact with them. It's astonishing. I'm talking to the Arabic language instructor at Haifa University. She teaches Arabic for a living, used to translate it for the military. And I was shocked to find out that she only understands Fusha. She can only understand modern standard. She doesn't know the Palestinian spoken dialect. And I'm like, Eastern Arabic, the Syrian Palestinian dialect is not that far off from it. You could just wander down to Wadi Nisnas, have some conversations, and pick that shit up in weeks. So I'm asking her, why don't you walk down the street and talk to Arabs? And she looks at me with this bugged out eyes, this shock. But I'm a Jew, like just shocked that I would suggest she talk to an Arab. That kind of self-segregation really, it reflects a culture that is probably about as, if we want to use the term racist here, as the US was 80 years ago.
Okay, so let me ask you a difficult question, because I know this is something a lot of Jews believe. I want to be delicate here, so I'm going to that the Palestinian people were created by neglect from the rest of the Arab community. This is what you will hear. Excuse me for once. Let me just finish the thinking. That the Palestinians were never a defined people. That Yasser Arafat was really Egypt. This is stuff that Alan Dershowitz will say. That Yasser Arafat was.
No more, Alan Dershowitz. You can end it right there.
That Yasser Arafat was born in Egypt, that the Palestinians it was never a country, it was never a nation of Palestinians, that when the Israelis won the Six-Day War in 1967, they took the West Bank from Jordan, where the Palestinians had been living. They were being treated like crap by the Jordanians, that they took the Gaza Strip from the Egyptians. The Palestinians were being treated by the Egyptians like crap. In Lebanon, you had Palestinian refugee camps, that Lebanon was not accepting Palestinians into their country, and that this is what the defenders of Israel, some of the defenders of Israel, will say, that there wasn't a Palestinian identity until they were either removed from Palestine or Israel, or taken from Jordan and Egypt. Is that?
The best lies always have a kernel of truth to them, and that's what helps to make them so compelling.
Right.
It is absolutely true that all of the surrounding Arab states treated the Palestinians like shit. And a good part of the reason for that is that they were themselves recently decolonized states and were looking to increase their own power however they could. what arguments like that.
You're talking about Jordan, Egypt, and Syria and Lebanon.
I mean, right. Lebanon, they did not make them citizens. Syria did not make them citizens. Egypt did not make them citizens. Jordan is the only one that actually even offered them citizenship. And there is still a kind of like de facto social issues where people kind of know, yeah, you're Palestinian or you're not, you know. But it's the only one that even offered citizenship.
The argument is that if there is going to be a homeland for the Palestinians, it should be Transjordan, that Jordan is a manufactured state as well, and that...
Well, all of the states in the region are manufactured states that are
exactly
very recent vintage. I mean, what is Lebanon other than an enclave created by the French where they hoped that there could be a religiously dominant Christian Maronite and Christian Greek Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox community that was hived off from, you know, the territory of Sham, greater sort of Syria. The whole region was known as sort of Syria or Sham, and that includes today's Palestine, Jordan, Israel,
right,
Syria, and Lebanon. So these are all products of that Mandate period and the collapse of and the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. So none of these states, you know, have what we would think of as the kind of, you know, long history and legitimacy. This, for example, nation states that emerged out of Western Europe, Peace of Westphalia, and so on. You know, these are all products of colonialism and you know, modernity and the breakup of multi-ethnic, multi-religious empires and those kinds of states, and the way in which nationalism and colonialism together have created very arbitrary ideas of political community that include some people and exclude others in mixed areas. And this created all kinds of problems.
And nationalism, so just so people understand or remember, you're talking about the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, which was Turkey, but all of this land belonged to the Ottomans, is that?
Yeah, it was under the Ottomans for centuries, since Selim I conquered, you know, Iraq, Syria, Egypt in 1516, ended the Mamluk state. There was a Mamluk power that controlled the Levant, Egypt and the Levant, for a few centuries.
None of these countries, just for simpletons like me, before World War I, the Ottomans sided with Germany and Austria-Hungary, and so after World War I, Turkey had to give up the Middle East, and it was divided between the British and the French, the mandates, right? Is that, am I getting?
Yeah. Yeah, but and that again takes us back to the beginnings of nationalism and where Zionism like made sense within its own origins time-wise, but is really out of step now. The fact is, none of these identities go back very far. Arab nationalism is a product of World War I. Before that, you had Arabist movements within the Ottoman Empire pushing for greater rights, local autonomy.
And that was a response to Ottoman nationalism, right?
Exactly, to Turkish nationalism. When the Turks started saying, okay, we're going to use Turkish in schools. And the Arabs are like, dude, we don't speak Turkish, so why the hell are you teaching our kids in Turkish? We want Arabic in the schools. So they pushed back. But it's only with atrocities during World War I and the massive push toward a Turkish ethno-nationalism that saw, you know, massacres of Greeks, Assyrians, Armenians, that you saw the development of Arab nationalism. I mean, the Martyr Square in Lebanon is named for people who were hanged during World War I for agitating for Arab causes. But Zionism also is only a late 19th century development. There was no pre-existing Jewish national identity. Jews were a distinct religious faction, but the only thing that connected Persian Jews to Polish Jews to Moroccan Jews was Torah. Their culture was different. Their language was different. They had no common national identity. Zionism manufactured a Jewish national identity, and all of the states around that area manufactured identities, Lebanese identity, Assyrian identity, with, you know, varying levels of success. I mean,
a Jew might say, okay, I want to be careful here because I'm learning a lot more, and I'm beginning to a shift on what I think needs to be done. Well, I'm going to hold back on what I was going to say. I don't think it's valuable.
Well, I just was going to say, let's point out also that it was an ideology that served Europe that had been practicing exclusion. You've heard of the Jewish question. They didn't want to give full political, social rights to Jews because they were undergoing forms of political identity and affiliation that were exclusive, around this idea of nation themselves, and Jews didn't fit into the nation because they existed in diaspora all across different, territories and polities, and also, of course, had religious difference. And even though we think of these as the era of secular nation states, that nonetheless they were built on the secularization of Christian culture. That's the Sunday is a holiday, okay, not, Thursday or Friday for a reason, right? Christmas is a national holiday, U.S., all across Europe. So even though they're secular states, they preserved, Christian culture. And part of that contradiction was that they didn't understand how would you integrate Jews into full rights and citizenship. And so as a response to that, there develops this idea of Jewish nationalism, remaking Jews from the Jew of the ghetto to a Jew who has political rights, who exists in history, has a state. And, rather conveniently for far-right nationalists in Europe, this would happen somewhere else, okay? And the era of colonialism would be the vehicle through which, Europeans had already gone out. And so you could become a real, civilized European and be a superior brand of civilization by going out and, creating a new country, eliminating the natives, expropriating their land, or dominating a subject population of them. And that's, the tragic circumstances of how this happened. And what when we talk about the need for a Jewish national home, I fully understand that, having studied, as I've talked with you in the past, this long history of discrimination, racial and religious bigotry that has developed principally in Europe, that there would be a need for some sense of, a haven, a homeland, and where their culture and religion would be protected and so on. But I guess my main point about this is that the best form of security is actually justice and equality with those that you live with. You will never feel secure if you're trying to protect a certain kind of privilege as a dominant community. You always then have that problem of political subordination and oppression that never provides a sense of security. You can, attempt to create it and enforce it, but that involves having to promote violence, injustice, and so on. And ultimately, that's a losing game. It seems to me there are ways. Liam mentioned some. I think we've talked about other ways in which, it could be embedded. Friday, Saturday is a holiday. These, Yom Kippur and other will be national holidays. Hebrew as a recognized and official language. There are ways to embed that, and as well as a law that says that any, person who identifies as Jewish would, be able to come and have citizenship. There are ways you can do that. Germany does the same thing. If you're German, in other parts of Europe and, in the Sudetenland, as we recall, there were German populations outside of the national borders of the German state. And they were allowed to have, even in the post-World War II German national citizenship laws, to be able to have German citizenship. So you can certainly do something like that. But if fundamentally you don't recognize that the greatest security is equality and justice and equal political rights, that's the problem, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
We have to, first of all, Professor Adnan Husain, my daughter and I, anyway, we were talking about, I don't want to embarrass you, but you are, I just want to say what I'm experiencing, and I don't know what the answer is, other than something you talked about earlier, which is truth and reconciliation. Doing this show, I like to ask tough questions, and that is, what do you believe? What do you want? Are you being truthful? And I was forced to ask myself these questions in the lead up to the fighting in Gaza and Israel. And I confess to not being honest with myself about what I know, what I want, and am I being truthful? So I don't, I've talked about being a victim of my own expertise and thinking, well, in the best of all possible worlds, a one-state solution would work. But, I've studied this situation and I know what's possible and my kids are putting me on the ice floe. It's time for me. Doesn't matter what I think anymore. Doesn't matter what I think is possible anymore. The people who are preventing Medicare for all are the people who use the argument, sure, in the best of all possible worlds, but we have to do what's possible. So I'm willing to throw all that out, and I'm asking my audience to do truth and reconciliation by yourself and be honest with what you want. If you're Palestinian, if you're Jewish, if you're an American, ask yourself what you know about this situation and what you absolutely want. And neither side, at least in the United States, has been honest about what they truly want. They're not willing to articulate, to say out loud what they want. So I'd like to, just keep continuing this conversation. I don't know what the answer is. I think the first step is to find out what I want.
That's a great place to start. I think, just in my part of wrapping this up, Liam and I have been talking over a few weeks about fascism, and we wanted to extend this to talk about colonialism and racism. And so I think, as a way to sort of end this in terms of honest accounting, and also going forward, I hope in a future conversation we can develop and look at it a bit more. I was very much thinking about this quote from Aimé Césaire, the great Caribbean intellectual and poet who wrote in Discourse on Colonialism. Right at the beginning, he said, people are surprised. They become indignant. They say, how strange, but never mind, it's Nazism. It will pass. And they wait and they hope and they hide the truth from themselves, that it is barbarism. But the supreme barbarism, the crowning barbarism that sums up all the daily barbarisms, that it is Nazism, yes, but that before they were its victims, they were its accomplices. That they tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them, that they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then it had been applied only to non-European peoples. That they have cultivated that Nazism, that they are responsible for it, and that before engulfing the whole of Western Christian civilization in its reddened waters, it oozes, seeps, and trickles from every crack. So we as Americans, we have to remember, this history and understand that colonialism and racism, upon which this nation also was founded, has this disturbing history, and that's maybe the direction for us to go, because this is a global kind of point that Aimé Césaire is making. So whether we talk about Algeria, whether we talk about, Israel, Palestine, or the U.S., I mean, this is the reality of that history of colonialism and what it has wrought, and the legacy that we have to wrestle with.
Absolutely, and in wrapping up too, I'll say I'd love to keep talking about these issues.
Yes,
I mean the struggles of the anti-colonial struggles and the development of anti-colonial nationalisms is itself a fascinating topic. And if we're again going to be honest about a lot of these things, and if we're really going to look at Well, we've been talking about fascism a bit here. We have to actually acknowledge that the roots of the current Israeli right are literally a fascist movement. Jabotinsky's revisionist Zionist movement in the 1920s and 30s was explicitly fascist in its ideals, and that component has stayed consistently there. It has always been, dominant in the Likud and its self-conception, and we tend
which is
to ignore
one
that.
strain of the Israeli parliament,
right? Yeah,
which
exactly.
is why Netanyahu
just
loves Orban in Hungary,
right? Exactly, because they can see something in common, and why a lot of right wingers
love too.
The right wingers in America love Netanyahu and that government there, because they see reflected their own nationalist component. But we do have to recognize, and this is something that gets lost too in these discussions, because we'll constantly criticize Israeli policy, and obviously it is the powerful force here. But you're right; you were right to bring up the question of anti-Semitism early on, and Professor Husain as well. This question of anti-Semitism is not going away. What's interesting is that there's that transition from anti-Judaism to anti-Semitism in the 19th century, where it used to be hatred around the religion and exclusion of the religion. And because Europe, as it secularized, could no longer, justify the old Judenhass on religious bases, they invented a racist way of doing it. And that racist understanding of Jew hatred is not going away anytime soon, because nationalism hasn't gone away. As long as nationalism exists, anti-Semitism cannot go away. So we have to find some way of balancing these. And I would love to discuss with Professor Husain too, if we talk about like the Algeria situation is another great one, where you had a settler colony, and in the solution to it, I mean, it was so violent that a huge chunk of the population felt compelled to flee. Even though it was like their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents that had moved there. They left where they were born because they no longer felt they could live there. That's the long-term, that's the long-term end game for Israel. If we don't solve this problem, if we cannot deal honestly with what's going on here, it is going to collapse in a way that's going to be tragic for a lot of the people involved. And I don't want to see that. I don't want to see, us repeat something like the Algeria situation there.
Right. An argument could be made that the status quo can be maintained, sadly, for decades.
Which is the South African apartheid solution. It ends up getting more and more repressive, because as the Arab population grows, you have to exert more and more force to hold it in check. And that's the problem. It's going to get less and less tolerated internationally. And that ultimately is going to force a solution that's not what the Israeli people ultimately want.
But the
Likud's approach is suicidal.
Right. Although we have to wrap up, an argument could be made, and I've been saying this for weeks, that somehow the Israelis have succeeded in completely isolating the Palestinians, that there's nobody speaking for the Palestinians, not one country, not Saudi Arabia. Is that true, Professor Husain?
Well, I would say broadly that state support for the Palestinians, of course, is waning with these normalization deals and treaties and so on. But I think by the same token, you're seeing more and more Jews in the diaspora are questioning their support.
Especially the kids, especially the children.
Especially the younger generation. In fact, now I think the Israeli right wing doesn't even depend on Jews in the United States. They feel like that's a dangerous game and it's totally unreliable. And so their support really that they can count on are the Christian Zionists.
Yeah, evangelicals who ultimately hope for an apocalyptic war that will kill most Jews, which is a really interesting alliance.
Yeah.
All right. To be continued. Professor Adnan Husain, Dr. Liam O'Mara, what are I hate to give Twitter, I'm just conditioned to give out Twitter handles, and I don't even go on Twitter anymore. But what would you like to plug?
Yeah, they're in the chats. I mean, Liam O'Mara the fourth with the IV on there is.
I'm sorry, what is it?
Liam O'Mara the fourth with the the Roman IV. The Roman
and
4.
Before I plug the Mudgeless podcast and Guerrilla History, are you doing any podcasts yet?
Yeah, we're launching Rogue Media, and I'm actually restarting up an old idea I'd had for a show. Office hours with the Mad Professor, where people can come and talk to me about anything, and then we just cut it and put it up there. So if anyone's interested in chatting about some topic in politics, history, philosophy, whatever, hit me up. Find me on Twitter, send me a DM, whatever. We'll record something and we're going to start putting content out there. And there's a whole bunch of other shows kind of like clustered together under Rogue Media.
Thank you for your generosity. Professor Adnan Husain hosts 2 podcasts. One is the Mujlis podcast. I'll ask him for the spelling on that in a second. And Guerrilla History with some guy, Henry something. Is it Henry Huckamaki? I hear he's a genius. I hear he's brilliant. I hear he's like an immunobiologist who's learned everything that there is to learn about immunobiology, and now he's moved into global affairs.
That's right. He's rising in his intellectual sophistication from the mere scientific to the truly artistic and intellectual, with his historical engagements and adventures. So we're delighted to be working with him. Mujlis is spelled Majlis. Please look up that podcast if you're interested in the Middle East, Islamic world, or Muslim diasporas. And after office hours this last Friday, and a lot of questions that I've been getting on Twitter and elsewhere about Middle Eastern and Islamic history, I'm thinking about doing a kind of just public course on Middle Eastern history and the rise of Islam. So watch for details around that. Once I work out those details, I'll announce it on the show.
Great. And thank you for even thinking about doing that. Thank you. We're eating into Henry's time. Henry Huckamaki joins us. He hosts. Thank you, Dr. Liam O'Mara. Both of you, I cannot thank you for your generosity and how liberating this has been for me to, I don't want to go into details, but my mother hates Bibi Netanyahu more than she hates Trump. So